Over the past couple years, the UFC pay-per-view numbers and the UFC organization as a whole has been declining rapidly. You look at fights that they used to have, these massive cards, UFC 229, McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, absolutely amazing bout. Nowadays, you don't have as many big bouts as you used to then. The fight nights are a lot worse, and a lot of different things are coming into fruition between the UFC and all of their different fighters, especially with their pay-per-view numbers declining very, very rapidly. Today, we are going to go jump in and talk about why possibly the UFC has been declining, why the fandom isn't as interested to watch the UFC now compared to as it was. Now, this is kind of talking more about the general fan. Us hardcore fans, if you're here watching this video, you probably do watch all the fight nights. You are interested in all the different types of UFC content that goes out every week. And you guys are always wanting to stay updated with the and notified about everything going on in the UFC. But for the general fan, the UFC has been falling off, and these are probably the reasons why it's going down. The UFC's pay-per-view buys have been going down and down and down with these cards. You look at some of the last cards that they've had, especially UFC 312, which wasn't a very prolific card, and UFC 313, honestly, which wasn't one either. It is $80 for the UFC pay-per-view. I don't know how many people can afford that on a regular Saturday night to get 5 fights worth of material that, that a lot of people are going and pirating and all this different type of stuff, considering of how unstacked these cards are truly going. I want to look at UFC 312. This was the card in Sydney, Australia. Honestly, this was $80 for a pay-per-view to where it was Matthews versus Prado, Crute versus Bolato, Tafa versus Teixeira, Zhang versus Suarez title fight, and DDP versus Strickland. The only really, really good fight on there is DDP versus Strickland. I know Zhang versus Suarez was a good fight, but women's fights don't get the type of attention and notoriety that they're supposed to. And even that main event, DDP versus Strickland, was a very, very underwhelming fight. Now looking forward to fights like Alex Pereira and Magomed Ankalaev. Very, very big card coming in. And all of a sudden, it dropped off tremendously with the talent. Obviously, Justin Gaethje versus Dan Hooker was supposed to be a big fight. With Rafael Fiziev stepping in, it was still a big fight. Ignacio Bahamondes versus Jalen Turner was a big one. But then you have another fight on the card, which I can't even remember off the top of your head. Mauricio Rufy got an incredible knockout in that card. But even then, he doesn't bring the stardom and the name power for the casual fan to really understand his kind of presence inside the octagon. I think genuinely the UFC has to make less cards. And I know for us hardcore fans, we love to see UFC fighting every single weekend. But for the sport, we got to stack these individual cards, ever so slightly. Let's look at the card this past weekend. Emmett versus Murphy. Honestly, that main event, pretty good fight night main event. In my opinion, though, if that was a co-main event for a fight night, that would be so much of a better bout. Put Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev as the main event. Stack these cards a little bit more. Get more people coming in to tune into these smaller fight night cards, especially since these are being paid for through ESPN Plus and whatnot. And genuinely, these smaller fight nights need to really be, going forward and being put forth with a better product at hand. Now, I think another solution that the UFC needs to do, if we look back at the undeserved title shots over the past year, I can name a very good amount of them. First off, Stipe Miocic. I know the casual fan is going to want to see Jon Jones fight. The name recognition, the name value is a very big guy going in there. And genuinely, I do think that it was a massive fight to be had. But that fight, we all knew what the result was going to be. We knew Jon Jones was going to go in there and win. The only way Stipe was going to win that fight is if he went and genuinely turned back the clock and showed everyone in the world that he is still the same person that he was 4 years ago or 5 years ago when he beat Daniel Cormier and beat Francis Ngannou the first time and beat all those different heavyweights in that division. Also, look at the main event of UFC 310. Kaya Sakaru versus Alexandra Pantoja. Now, I know that this is a little different because this was previously scheduled to be the co-main event, which got replaced as the main event when Bilal Muhammad pulled out. But Kaya Sakaru's first fight in the UFC was against Alexandre Pantoja, where he got absolutely abominated in that fight. He got absolutely destroyed by Pantoja, considering of how good he is, and it got the second round submission. I mean, Alexandre Pantoja is one of the best fighters, and again, he's not one of these guys who is going to be super marketable to the average fan. But Pantoja is one of the pound for pound top fighters in the organization and is genuinely someone that everyone should go out and watch. Another fight that's technically a big fight is Israel Adesanya versus DDP. Israel Adesanya was coming off a loss to Sean Strickland and losing 2 out of his last 3 fights. One of those was to Pereira and one of those was to Strickland. Like I said, I don't think that was a deserved title shot either way. And look forward, Adesanya lost to DDP and just lost to Nasruddin Imavov too. Chito Vera versus Sean O'Malley. Chito Vera was thrusted into that title position because the current champion at the time, Sean O'Malley, wanted to get that rematch with Mr. Vera, who beat him in a very peculiar way in their first bout back in 2020, I believe. And Sean O'Malley went out there and absolutely displayed an absolute dominant performance, especially in the striking department, showing of why there is levels to the game. Now, other guys like Dustin Poirier getting a title shot, I do understand. I mean, his name is so big in the sport, and he did do very well against Islam Makhachev, but beating Benoit Saint Denis, I genuinely don't think should be the pathway to get there. Now you got guys like Justin Gaethje after beating Rafael Fiziev a second time off, coming off 2 weeks notice after no fight being announced for him, asking for a title shot in the lightweight division, which is a very, very, very interesting place for him to be. Look at other guys that have had these title shots going in, and genuinely, I think it is a very, 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 bad place for the UFC to be giving these undeserved title shots, especially when you had the Marabs of the world who were on a 10-fight win streak, especially when you had guys like Hamzat Chimaev, who just beat Robert Whittaker and need to get a title shot, especially over someone like Sean Strickland, who just beat Paulo Costa over a 5-round bout that was incredibly boring. You got all these different type of guys going up there, and genuinely, I think looking forward, the UFC needs to kind of prioritize the current fighters and the winners now to build up stars. And I understand that you got these kind of names like Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje and Israel Adesanya, but they're only going to be here for so long, and I don't understand why you would want to put more stock in these guys that aren't going to be here for the long run. And lastly, I think going back to the pay-per-view, you got to lower the pay-per-view. I mean, I genuinely look at how $80 for a 1-5-card fight once a month is an unreasonable price, especially when fans can go out and pirate. I mean, it is a very big problem, but fans wouldn't want to pay the $80 to watch a fight when they could just go out there and watch it for free. I mean, the UFC needs to find a new way, and I do see that the overall pay-per-view numbers, except for UFC 306 and UFC 309, which were absolutely massive bouts, and UFC 300 were massive bouts last year, but those were for different reasons. 300 was the most stacked card of all time. UFC 306 was held in the Sphere, and John Jones held UFC 309. And genuinely, I look at all these bouts, and I throw them as outliers. For the usual cards that they've had, the Khalil Roundtrees against Alex Pereira, the Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera, no matter how good these fight cards were, you cannot be paying $80 to watch this fight. Genuinely, the UFC needs to kind of go down to either a subscription to where they can get all the fights for the year, or possibly a monthly subscription of $30 or some number like that, $20 for all of the pay-per-view cards, the big cards, small cards, something like that, to get more engagement around the community, especially tuning in for these big and small cards. I think Dana White is doing the best thing possible here, especially with his negotiations for the UFC rights after the 2025 year. He's talking to Netflix to possibly do a subscription, but considering how that Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight went, I don't know if that's going to exactly go well, and everything in between. Ultimately, the UFC is in a very tough position to where they need to go out and perform with numbers, especially to grow the sport. But I think the biggest thing that they need to do is invest in the future rather than take what they have in the past. Obviously, if some guys are keeping going, like Justin Gaethje just beat Fiziev, you got guys like Bilal Muhammad, who's a current champion, who's kind of on his way out, Michael Chandler, one of the most exciting fighters inside the organization, but you got to put it into these younger stars' hands and let them grow the sport for a very long time coming. Overall, I look at the UFC's organization and I see that the pay-per-view numbers and the card quality just isn't as good. More than lately, I have been skipping fight cards to watch something else, go out with friends, do something like that, when in reality, I was always so attentive for these cards that were absolutely amazing. I'll always remember where I was to watch UFC 300. I'll always remember where I was to watch UFC 287. I'll always remember where I was to watch UFC 285. These cards that were a little bit more stacked and kind of all these different type of things. And even going back farther, UFC 200, UFC 229 with Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov, and all these different cards with these superstars is the biggest thing. But I think in this, especially in the UFC, not having a massive superstar to connect with the common fan is the biggest issue, and kind of all these other things that I've kind of resolved in this video. I think that there isn't an easy pathway for the UFC to really go out there and fix this, but genuinely, I do think the UFC is in a little bit of a struggle boat in the current time period, considering that they have been dealing with one of the biggest fall-offs, not in sports currently, but genuinely seeing of how their cards have been stacked, of how the average fan is viewing their content, and of how genuinely their cards are declining with pay-per-view numbers. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and I will catch you guys very soon with more UFC content and news.